There's a specific feeling, and if you know it, you'll recognize it immediately. It's not guilt about something you did. It's not tied to a specific action or a moment you can point to and say, "That's where I went wrong." It's more ambient than that. More structural. A low, persistent hum underneath ordinary life that says, "Your presence is too much. Your needs are an imposition. You owe something just for taking up space. You apologize before you've done anything. You make yourself smaller in conversations, in rooms, in relationships. Not because you've been asked to, but because some part of you is always pre-apologizing for the fact of being there at all. And if someone points it out, if they say, "You don't have to apologize for that. You apologize for apologizing." That's not guilt. Not in the technical sense. Guilt is about something you did. Has a specific object. Repair. What this is runs deeper. Researchers who study emotion with precision draw a sharp line between two experiences that most people use interchangeably. June Price Tangney at George Mason University, whose work on shame and guilt is among the most rigorous in the field, defines them this way. Guilt says, "I did something bad." Shame says, "I am bad." Guilt is about behavior. Shame is about identity. And the critical difference between them, her research shows, is what they do to a person. Guilt, in manageable doses, is actually adaptive. It motivates repair. Shame, on the other hand, tends to produce withdrawal, hiding, and the chronic sense that there is something fundamentally wrong with who you are. What most people who feel guilty for existing are actually experiencing is shame. Not guilt about actions. Shame about the self. And shame of this kind, the kind that doesn't attach to anything specific, the kind that just sits there as a baseline, has an origin. It didn't arrive from nowhere. It was taught. If this video gave you even a small sense that you're allowed to take up space, hold on to that. Because the version of you that says no, that asks for things, that doesn't apologize for existing, that version is not selfish. That version is just new. There's more where this came from. Link in the description. And in the first pinned comment. John Bowlby's attachment research, and the decades of developmental psychology that built on it, documented something that gets less attention than it deserves. Emotional neglect. Not abuse, not cruelty, but the consistent absence of emotional attunement, leaves a specific mark. When a child's needs are met with sighs, with withdrawal, with distraction, with "not now," with a parent who is physically present but emotionally elsewhere, the child doesn't conclude that the parent is unavailable. Children don't have the cognitive framework for that. They conclude something much closer to home. They conclude that the need itself is the problem. Not, "I need something and it isn't available," but, "I need something and that need is wrong. I am wrong for having it." And if that conclusion is confirmed enough times, through the sigh that arrives when they ask, through the energy that shifts when they need something, through the praise that comes when they're quiet and undemanding and the discomfort that arrives when they're not, it stops being a conclusion and becomes a belief. Felt sense. Something that lives in the body, not just the mind. That belief is where existential guilt comes from. And here's how it shows up in adult life. The constant apologizing, not for specific things but preemptively, reflexively, for the space they're taking before anyone has asked them to take less. The difficulty receiving compliments, not from false modesty, but because a compliment implies they're worth giving to, and some part of them is still waiting for that to be proven wrong. The impulse to minimize their needs, their feelings, their preferences, their opinions. To introduce everything with "I might be wrong but," or "sorry this might be stupid," or "I don't want to bother you but." And then there's the version of this that looks least like shame from the outside. The chronic overgiving. If you give enough, if you are useful enough, present enough, generous enough, maybe you've paid enough rent that your existence is justified. Maybe you've earned your place. Maybe the account is balanced. Until the next day, when it has to be earned again. And the exhaustion that comes from that, from the relentless work of justifying your own presence, is unlike other kinds of exhaustion. 'Cause it never resolves. No amount of giving, no accumulation of achievement, no number of people who tell you that you're good enough actually touches it. Because it wasn't formed by evidence. And it can't be dismantled by evidence alone. But here's something that almost nobody explains about this pattern. The shame wasn't arbitrary. And it wasn't a mistake the child made. In an environment where your needs are experienced as burdens by the people who are supposed to carry them, developing a belief that your needs are wrong is adaptive. It reduces conflict. It orients you toward the emotional states of others, which is where the actual power lies. It keeps you from repeatedly reaching for something you won't receive. The shame was a tool. An incredibly costly one. But a tool. The problem isn't that it formed. The problem is that it kept running into adulthood, into new rooms with new people, as though the original environment were still the one it was navigating. Feeling guilty for existing isn't proof that you are too much. It's proof that you were in an environment where being yourself consistently produced the wrong response. And you adapted the way all children do by deciding the most logical explanation was you. And that adaptation, logical as it was in the original context, carried something forward that the original context never intended to give you. A relationship with your own existence that has an asterisk on it. A way of being in rooms that always includes a quiet background calculation. How much space is too much? Have I given enough to justify staying? Is my presence here something that has been earned, or am I still in debt? Most people who carry this have no idea how much energy it consumes. Because it runs constantly beneath every other activity. The monitoring never stops. And the question it's always asking, am I too much? Never gets a satisfying answer because it was never a fair question to begin with. The shame doesn't respond to evidence. You can succeed enormously, give generously, be loved clearly and specifically, and the background frequency doesn't shift. Because it isn't measuring what you've done. It's measuring what you believe you fundamentally are. And what you believe you fundamentally are was written very early, in a context that needed you to make yourself smaller so it could function. The context needed that. You didn't deserve it. And here's what that distinction, between what the context needed and what you deserved, actually means for the person trying to understand it now. June Price Tangney's research makes something clear that most people who live inside chronic shame have never been told. Shame is not self-knowledge. It is a conclusion drawn from evidence that was always incomplete. The child who decided that their needs were wrong was reading the environment accurately. The environment was responding to their needs with insufficient warmth, with implicit cost. But the conclusion they drew was the only one available to a developing mind without the cognitive capacity to locate the problem outside themselves. And here's where it gets specific and important. That conclusion, I am wrong for having needs, was not the truth. It was the only explanation available within the logic of a child's world, where the people you depend on are, by necessity, right, and the only available variable is you. The environment that withheld didn't do so because you were too much. It withheld because it was too little, too burdened, too depleted, too unavailable, to hold what you were genuinely bringing to it. And the gap between those two explanations is the distance between shame and something else entirely. Grief, perhaps, for what wasn't there. Or simply the understanding that you were in a context that couldn't do what contexts are supposed to do, and you adapted accordingly. Which means the adapted version, the one who shrinks, who pre-apologizes, who earns their place every day, was never the truth about you. It was the truth about the environment. Those two things have been confused for a very long time. No one decides to become the person who gives everything. It happens gradually. In an environment that rewarded a certain version of you, and made another version feel unsafe. By the time you were old enough to question it, it already felt like just who you were. I've gone much deeper into how this starts, and what it looks like over time. Everything is linked in the description, and in the first pinned comment. Now I want to ask you something directly. When someone does something kind for you without a reason, without owing you anything, just because they wanted to, what's the first thing that moves through you? Is it warmth? Or is it something more complicated? A faint suspicion, maybe, or a quiet urgency to return the gesture immediately, to balance the account before it tips too far in your favor. And this one, when you take up space in a conversation in a room with your own needs, are you monitoring it? Is there a quiet part of you keeping track of how much, making sure it doesn't become too much? And have you ever caught yourself apologizing for something that needed no apology at all? Not a thing you did, just a thing you are? If any of those landed, here's what I want you to hear. The feeling that you're too much or not enough, or that your existence requires constant justification. That feeling is not a report on who you are. It's a residue of where you came from. And those two things are not the same thing, even though they've felt that way for a long time. You were not born guilty. You were taught to feel that way by a context that needed something specific from you. Your smallness, your compliance, your willingness to prioritize everyone else's comfort above your own. And you delivered it because that's what children do. And now that you're in rooms that don't require that of you anymore, some part of you is still delivering it anyway. What would it mean? Not to become a different person, not to undo everything you've built, but simply to stop pre-apologizing for one day. To take up the space that is actually yours in one conversation, without shrinking before anyone has asked you to. That's not arrogance. That's just the distance between where you are and where you were always allowed to be. If something in this video found you today, leave a comment. Tell me one thing you've apologized for that needed no apology. I read everything. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because next week we go into something that feeds directly into this. The pattern that forms when a person learns before they have language for it, that their needs are more burden than right. It goes somewhere very few people have looked.